Namo Amida Buddha. This is the Hongaku Jodo presentation of the problem of attachment, which we see as the curse of being human. I am Sensei Mui, and I will be your host through this teaching. And let's start with some definitions. We'll start with the definition of emotion, because attachment does fall under the general category of emotion. Emotions are often defined as a complex state of feeling that results in physical and psychological changes that influence thought and behavior. And if you're into Zen or Pure Land Buddhism, you know that that is the basic problem that all of us have. It comes from the word imova, which means to stir, to agitate, or to move. Now there are physical components of emotion, and this is the physiological arousal that accompanies the emotion. Then there's the cognitive component, which determines the specific emotion we feel. And there's the behavioral component of emotion, which is the outward expression of the emotions, or how we act out when we feel one way or another. And these are all based upon sensation, as we say in Buddhism, or feeling. And that is merely the experience of pleasantness or unpleasantness. There's also a neutral category, which is neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but it's very difficult to find a situation that we're totally neutral about. Every emotion is accompanied by an impulse or an inner drive toward an action of one kind or another, and the mode of expression depends upon the intensity of the emotion that we're feeling. The more intense, the more drastic the motion. The physical and psychological components refer to the actual body movements we make, how we actually act out. An emotion is always aroused by stimuli, which may seem random at the time of the emotion, or it can be something very specific. Some people have very, very specific reactions when they see a photograph of an ice cream cone, a child, a pony, a unicorn, or Donald J. Trump, the current occupant of the White House. The stimulus is only symbolic. It is not what we are actually responding to. We're responding to something much deeper. Now, some psychologists will tell you there are as many as 50 different kinds of emotions. In the Abhidhamma, depending on whose commentary you're reading, there are 52, 54, 56 different mind states which correspond to these huge emotions that we feel. And the more emotions we have, the prettier our chart about emotions. But if you're not into complicated and ornate charts, this one will do just fine. It is the four basic emotions that all of us feel constantly throughout the day. They are anger and fear, which happen to be closely related, sadness and joy, which happen to be opposites. They are the four root emotions, as we like to call them, and they are the emotive responses that underpin every action we take. The first one, let's deal with fear. It is a learned behavior, according to Barack Obama, Nelson Mandela, and many, many, many psychoanalysts and psychotherapists. But there's also an instinctual component to it. We fear threats to our safety, threats to our comfort. We work because we're afraid. We're afraid of losing our job, our income, our home, our spouse, our self-respect, our status in the community, a buck at the end of the week. And we tend to lie about our fears because they will betray our true motives and Sometimes we're afraid those motivations will not be understood. We also lie to avoid punishment. I think everybody that ever grew up knows about that one. We fear to be punished, and so we'll tell a blatant lie even when we're caught in the act. No, I did not have my hand in the cookie jar. You misinterpreted what you saw. But then again, we'll lie to increase our status, the way others look at us, to gain respect from others, and we'll lie to make ourselves feel better about ourselves. After all, I have read a few books in nuclear physics, therefore I must be a nuclear physicist. I once watched a mechanic fix a car, so I know how to fix a car. These are lies we tell ourselves all the time, and it's really embarrassing when we get caught because there was probably no reason to tell a lie, but sometimes we're accused of lying even if we don't embellish. Even if we do have evidence that we have done this, that, or the other thing, there are some people that you can't prove jack to because they already have their minds made up. And these are the people I fear the most because who knows where their minds are going. And we are all afraid of different things. Some people claim they're not afraid of death, but they are afraid of the pain that will come when they die. And so they go to great lengths to avoid the pain, but not death itself, so they say. Now, everybody is probably afraid of being mauled by a bear. Bears are kind of spooky, and we see lots of movies about bears. And there's a very friendly bear, and I don't think anybody would be afraid of being mauled by him until they look at his paws. Those razor-sharp instruments of death staring at us. This one was apparently bathing. But we're also afraid of pretty silly things, too, like getting caught wearing your mother's underwear. A lot of people are afraid of that, even though they don't want to mention it. Humans are the most fearful animals on the planet of the earth. We can find more things to be afraid of than we'll ever encounter. People are afraid of terrorists. People are afraid of individuals that they'll never meet. People are afraid of conditions which will never come upon them. People are afraid of the coming depression. And the depression's not even here yet. So we tend to be afraid of this thing because we know it's inevitable. It will eventually show up. Like Homeland Defense Police and Donald Trump. Many of us fear that. It's a vicious cycle. The more we imagine, the more afraid we become. The universe is extraordinarily user-friendly. The universe will put things in our path just because we want them there. So the more we fear, the more we find that we're afraid of because there's more there to be afraid of. And it works the same with peace and harmony and love. The more we are peaceful, the more we are harmonious, the more we love, the more the universe gives us to feel peaceful about, to feel in harmony with, and that we can love and will love us back. But we tend to put fear out there because since December 7th, 1941, we have told to be very, very afraid. We're afraid of the Japanese. We were afraid of the Nazis. Now we're afraid of the Nazis again. And in between, we were afraid of communism, hippies, college students, Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Syria, brown people, black people, and it's all because we fear social groups because of stereotypes we ourselves create about them. So actually we're afraid of our own imagination. But these fears can spread far beyond you. They're contagious. And some scientists think that they may also have a genetic component behind them because the brain responds to fear. And this would probably be a good sign that genetics plays a role in at least how we respond to fear, if not what we're afraid of. in itself. Fear activates the amygdala, which overrides the frontal cortex, making rational thought damn near impossible. It will instigate a freeze response, possibly because of the ancestral inheritance of being prey to other animals who like to chase their prey. I'm told, but I've not tested this theory out, that if a mountain lion is looking at you like you are a snack, don't move, because as soon as you move, it will attack you. So you're supposed to just sort of stand there, because if you're standing there, you're probably not edible. You're just an odd sort of looking tree, I suppose. It also helps us in our flight response to move away from the source of fear. If we're afraid we're going to be mauled by a bear or a mountain lion, it's probably a good idea to quickly but quietly leave the area. And then there is the fight response, which appears whenever we believe, either reasonably or unreasonably, that there's a contest between life and death. And that's when we feel like we want to do something, and then you can just say hello to anger, because that's the next thing that is going to pop up. It arises when something is perceived to be not quite the way we think it should be. We can feel emotionally or physically threatened, and the anger response occurs about a half a second after we have seen or heard that which we feel threatened by. It starts out with a rush of adrenaline, and then the amygdala comes in and it wants to do something, wants to make something to happen to alleviate this threat. But unlike fear, the frontal cortex is not overridden, and rational thinking can assert itself. Now, anger is very close to fear, because if you notice, it's an emotional or physical response to a threat, the same as fear. But the fear is not quite as intense at this point. When one is angry, one is always afraid of losing something, even if it's the opportunity to have something. We become angry over the fear of losing face, as they say, self-respect. We become angry when we think something has been taken away from us that we actually never possessed. The ability to reason tends to curb violence. This is not true in fear, as I've said. And the entire process from anger arising to the frontal cortex taking over is of less than 2 seconds. It happens in a little over a second and a half. This is why counting the breath, just counting, or reciting a mantra or chanting Namo Amitabha Buddha silently is really sound scientific advice. It gives the brain an opportunity to override the chemical process which it has just started. Women tend to get angry due to relationships. Anybody that's involved in a marriage or a romantic affair knows all about this one. Women tend to become angry when the ones they love seem to have screwed them over in some way. Men tend to become more angry due to the actions of strangers. Men become angry when somebody they don't know might have said something they never heard. We tend to get angry when things aren't working right. Frustration often manifests as angers. And we get angry at societal issues, like, darn the government for not doing something about those funny-looking people in South Chicago. The purpose of anger, and anger does serve a purpose just like fear does, it arises due to a real or perceived threat. And that threat has to be dealt with. It arises when our goals are thwarted, and that is called frustration. It arises when the frustration of failed expectations occurs. And the purpose of anger, at least in our society, seems to be to mask our fear by making us seem brave. Unlike fear, anger seems to have social benefits. Fear has no social, psychological, or spiritual benefits, but this socially beneficent emotion of anger is called a disease in Buddhism. Try the chapter on anger in the Dhammapada, which describes what an angry person looks like and how they respond to life. And this is where phrases like, he beat me, he hit me, he insulted me, if these arise within your mind, there can be no peace. Peace only arises when one feels non-hostile. The Buddha never said love displaces anger. He said non-hostility, that is, peace, is what displaces anger. Anger can be generally said to be an unskillful behavior that is socially acceptable in the United States, which is seen to, by Americans anyway, to increase productivity, set boundaries, assert dominance, either real or imagined, and helps us to move forward in complex situations. I'm not sure how any of that is possible when reason has been diminished by the amygdala, the fear response. How far forward and in what directions are we generally going to go in a complex situation when we are pissed off? Boundaries, sure, it sets boundaries, but it also burns bridges. It turns life into a competition rather than a cooperative. And as far as asserting dominance, how long can you maintain that? Dominance itself is an illusion. But we have modes of anger because we love to become angry after all. Is it not said in some of the spiritual texts that there is such a thing as righteous anger? Well, in Buddhism, since we consider anger a disease, that's like saying righteous anger would be a disease like righteous chlamydia, righteous herpes, righteous ingrown toenails. You get my point. Anger can be passive, it can be aggressive, and it can be assertive. And these are the three modes of anger. Aggressive anger. Let's start with that one. It manifests as bullying. It manifests as selfishness. It manifests as vengeance, which explains the U.S. legal system and religious systems of justice, because justice is pronounced just us. And it links us most closely with our most ancient ancestors, who happen to be tribal nomadic societies or even cave dwellers. And when we get really, really pissed off, we seem to be related to other wild animals. And it acts as an instantaneous response that promotes the illusion of control, rarely evolves rational thought at the moment it arises, and when we're screaming, yelling, and threatening, our actions are not very different from a dog barking at the postman who is infringing on his territory. Passive anger. Passive anger is, at one time, was considered to be a neuroses. When I was in college taking my Psych 101 class, passive aggressive behavior was listed as one of the top 10 neuroses infecting the middle class. Well, as it turns out, passive aggressive behavior, that is passive anger, is taught in colleges, and it tends to manifest as evasiveness and manipulation, but it does avoid confrontation. When we're evasive and manipulative, we sound, well, can you think of any names who behaves like that in a regular manner? refusing to answer questions directly, making stuff up as they go along, trying to manipulate your feelings by saying, oh, those things that were said about me are just fake news. It does avoid confrontation, but it is also dangerous in that the internalization of emotions will make us more likely to attack others who aren't even involved in the situation because we're suppressing our emotion, or we're not releasing that kind of energy. That leads to a dysfunctional socialization if it's habitual. We're passive. We want to be seen as passive. But at the same time, there's a whole lot of anger raging in our hearts, and we just don't know what to do with it. Assertive anger is probably the most acceptable behavioral form. It's socially accepted by most people. It requires a considered, measured approach to what is being perceived as unfair treatment by others. Unfortunately, it does lead to anger-driven decisions. But those actions that we act out in while we're making those decisions seem to be non-threatening. It allows us for ridding ourselves of the sense of unfairness while remaining passive. Now, let's make some important distinctions here very quickly. Anger and aggression are not synonymous. Anger is not inherently a bad trait. It's just a trait. Aggression may be present without anger. Anger may be present without aggression. Assertion and anger are not interchangeable words. Assertion is definitely a positive trait. We do want to assert our rights when we feel that they're being threatened. And that is a positive thing, I think. And anger does not have to be present when one is asserting oneself about oneself, or about what one feels like they've got coming to them. And this brings us to sadness and happiness. And these are feelings that one really wants and the other would like to avoid. Happiness and sadness are very, very much like attachment and aversion. They are intrinsically linked. In the absence of what causes one, happiness for instance, the other one is caused. So there's this kind of a seesaw effect, this balancing act between happiness and sadness. When we are not engaged in things that make us happy, we are definitely not doing things which make us unhappy. And this is partially controlled by genetics. According to some scientists, that we may be influenced as much as 50% by our DNA. And evidence shows that DNA is altered by meditation. So if our genetics is such that we're not generally cheery people, meditation can change that. 10% of our happiness is determined by lifestyle and situation. But we tend to place undue emphasis on that. If we're poor, we say we're unhappy because we're poor. But that's only 10% of the story. It would appear that the majority of the story, that why we're unhappy or happy, is actually due to something we can affect, and that is our own perceptions or learned behaviors. Now, some of the geneticists say that as much as 50% of our cheeriness could be determined by DNA. Others place that number down at 20 or 30%. So that would mean that at least 40% of our happiness or unhappiness is based upon our perception. And perception is a learned behavior. And it could be as much as 60 or 70% is determined by how we see things. So if this is true, then there must be a secret to happiness. Sure there is. Change your mind. This is why talking therapy is usually prescribed if antidepressant medication is given. Meditation also becomes a very common component of therapy because it helps change the mind, and we're not involved in the self-talk which makes us miserable. Buddhist meditation is most often prescribed while Western techniques, which tend to support a fabricated ego or illusion about ourselves, is discouraged. Buddhist meditation has become mainstream not only in therapy but also in other medical functions, and it's no longer considered to be an alternative approach or a complementary approach. Many therapists are using meditation as their main tool of treating people with some kind of emotional dysfunction. Now, the benefits of meditation is that it has been the most studied, and it is the most effective form of meditation about which we know. It's basically the only evidence-based kind of meditation technique, that is Buddhist meditation, that is available to us at the current time. Others may become evidence-based therapies, but at the moment, Buddhist meditations are about it. Yogic meditation is the second most often prescribed and scores very, very well, just underneath Buddhist meditation. And the interesting thing about that is that compared to Western psychologists, Western psychological therapeutic success, Buddhism and yoga actually come in twice as high in their success rates than do our standard Western techniques. Buddhist counseling is often prescribed as a mainstream therapy along with meditation therapy. Now for the bad news. Sadness is a necessity of life. It's a necessary component of human experience. Children cry due to sadness when they're away from their parents. They need their parents in order to survive, or at least they've learned this. Sadness in a relationship breakup helps us to push us into repeatedly investing ourselves into new relationships. Now, you're probably thinking of romantic relationships, and you have a reason to think that. But this also applies to family relationships, work relationships, sporting relationships, casual relationships like going to the coffee shop when you have a relationship with the barista there, and the barista is not there anymore, so you have to form relationships with new baristas so you can get your skinny latte, chocolate, soy, frappuccino. You have to have a relationship just to say that with a straight face. Sadness helps us focus and become more attentive. Apparently, in a 2007 study, people who were repressed scored much higher on complex math problems than did happy people. Now imagine that. So next time you're facing an examination, whether it's a driving exam or in college or trying to pass your bar or something, please don't break up with your partner and don't strangle your hamster. That's cheating. That is definitely cheating if you do that to try to get higher grades in school or at work. Now, there's a neuroscience behind happiness, and it works on a very cool level because we have a virtual pharmacopoeia in our brain. Maslow placed life purpose at the top of his hierarchy of needs, and he placed the biological functions such as sex and food at the bottom of his list. And most psychologists will see that as being true. But what do you find in advertising, on the city streets, on billboards, on the internet? You will find sex being the thing that is most often sold. We have been lied to into thinking having sex is really important to our personal individual lives. It may be important to the propagation of the species, but There are over 9 billion people on this planet, and many scientists feel that 10 billion is the limit that can be supported by this planet. How much procreation is really enough? So sex and the quality of food, how it tastes, is actually the least important thing in our lives. And they don't really contribute all that much to happiness. They only contribute to instant gratification. Each person individual levels of serotonin, endorphins, dopamine, and oxytocin may be genetically set at birth, but there are ways to deal with this beautiful pharmacopoeia that the brain has created for us to help us feel better about ourselves, about life in general, and even the situation in Washington, D.C. Now, imbalances in these naturally occurring drugs in the brain may lead to either euphoria, which we call mania, or depression, which we call depression. The first one of these drugs that I'd like to talk about is dopamine, and it helps boost our cognitive function. It helps us learn more. It helps us see things much more clearly. And it allows us to gain pleasure from completing a task, no matter what that task may be. It increases productivity by allowing us to think more clearly and focus better on what we're doing. Low levels are associated with chemical addiction. Higher levels are associated with routine creativity, and that includes vacuuming, doing the dishes, ironing, and so forth. Serotonin appears whenever we have a sense of accomplishment. High levels are associated with the feeling that our life has meaning, there is purpose to our being. But low levels are associated with depression and criminal activity. Without meaning in our lives, depression and unethical behavior abound. I wonder if that's that guy's problem. Oxytocin is released during orgasm, childbirth, breastfeeding, and gift giving. So if you get unusually horny on your birthday after Aunt Maud has given you a present, you'll know why. Endorphins are produced in the body to boost happiness in the face of anxiety or fears. And the levels of these drugs are greatly affected by the way we respond to stress. And we respond to stress dependent upon our emotional maturity and how we perceive things. And this leads us to the curse of living well. It has been found that in the past, harsh conditions like depressions, hurricanes, snowstorms, Betsy the cow not giving milk, these sorts of things gave meaning to life. They gave us a sense of purpose. We have to solve this problem. We have to solve that problem. In our relatively trouble-free life, we are exposed to the fact that we are unable to cope with minor issues of civilized life and the natural cycles of life itself. We have lost the ability to respond appropriately to both pleasant and unpleasant events. At this very moment, as we speak, because an event which took place in Charlottesville, Virginia, we are inappropriately responding to words and actions which actually don't affect us, but they offend our sensibilities. Are you kidding? Sound waves floating in air are causing riots. Sounds that have no inherent meaning in and of themselves, we turn into words, we give words meaning, and then we respond to the meaning we have given the words. Really? Okay. We attribute our lack of happiness to words being said. Oh, and we're too fat. We're too skinny. We're very bland or bald. We lack material things. We don't have enough toys. Donald Trump got elected. It's almost 2020 and we still do not have world peace, jetpacks, or a colony on Mars. Happiness does not depend on the conditions of our lives, but on how we perceive our lives to be. The study was done all the way back in 1978, when I was a mere shadow of my present self, and it was done by Northwestern University, which is just right up the road here, and the University of Massachusetts. The conditions of your life do not determine your happiness. How you perceive those conditions determines your happiness. Now we're talking about emotion. So what are the characteristics of an emotion? An emotion is a stirred up mental event, a state of mind that exists within a living organism. And that's any living organism. Anything from a contemporary Einstein to a contemporary amoeba. And possibly even plants. There's a lot of discussion about that at the moment. It is a specific condition of mind. We can label it, we can measure it, and it is based upon a feeling, a sensation of pleasantness or unpleasantness. The individual becomes aware, conscious of the sensation of pleasantness or unpleasantness. Thoughts arise due to the consciousness arising. Thoughts arise in response to this conscious awareness of sensation. Emotions are simply sensation plus conscious awareness plus proliferation of thought based on sensation. Now, in response to this, and this is the freaky part, in response to this emotion arising, we create an artificial ego, one that is fabricated to meet the need to avoid unpleasantness or attach and grab onto the pleasantness. It's not who we are, it is something that we have created. An emotion is always aroused by stimulus. Always aroused by stimulus. It doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Something has to stimulate or agitate the mind for it to happen. The same stimulus may arouse different emotions at different times. This occurs when our mood changes. So the same stimulus will cause happiness when we're in good mood, but sadness if we're in a bad mood. Maturation plays an important role in emotional development and our response to the emotions that we feel. So emotional maturation is extraordinarily important, and at one time our educational system promoted control over our emotions, to explore them. But we don't do that so much anymore, what with budget cutbacks and all that. Today it is felt that parents and teachers ought not to repress the child's emotional development. And attempts have been made to guide the child to adopt appropriate methods of emotional expression are seen sometimes as draconian, inappropriate. While after all, that's the parent's job. And if the parent does it, it may be called abusive. We're a very schizophrenic society when it comes to these sorts of things. But one thing is sure, emotions interfere in learning and the life process. Of this, we can be absolutely certain. We talk about emotion and We're actually talking about attachment in this class. Attachment is a form of addiction, as aversion is a form of addiction. Addiction in our society is usually defined as the fact or condition of being addicted, fancy that, to a particular substance, thing, or activity. Addictions always lead to dependency. Dependency is a state of being dependent upon or subordinate to a person, place, or thing. That is, if you are addicted, this is how you know you're addicted, when your attachment or your aversion has created a bottleneck in your life. You're controlled by another entity. That is, you have deliberately and voluntarily made yourself a slave, one of those trigger words, to something or someone else. And good luck to you if you do that. Mainly in the West, when we talk about addiction, we talk about physical addiction. But the word addiction is used in many different ways. We do have the physical addiction, which is a physiological state that the body adapts to the presence of a drug or substance, and that drug or substance no longer has the same effect. So we need more of it to get the same buzz, and this is called tolerance. The phenomenon of overreaction by the brain to drugs or cues are associated with the drug. And we do not associate them usually with the individual. But the individual is the one that has the brain, which is responding to drugs and cues. So why are we blaming the drug? Why don't we work with the person? For instance, if an alcoholic is silly enough to walk into a bar, they often feel the urge to have a drink because of the cues they see. Even if they walk by the bar and smell the fermentation and see the pretty neon lights and see the girls walking in and out and the guys walking in and out, looking all happy and glazed over like they don't have a care in the world, which they don't because they're totally anesthetized, then they have been witness to the cues which will cause them to want a drink. But you don't have to be an alcoholic to experience this. All addictive behaviors, whether they're physical or psychological, act in exactly the same way. Whether that addiction is to sex, religions, concepts and ideas, politics, money, internet, Facebook, OkCupid, the pickup community, whatever your favorite addiction, you're going to act the same every time. And this leads to obsessive compulsive behavior. Obsessions and compulsions. Most addictive behavior is not related to physical tolerance or exposure to cues. Most addictive behavior arises in the absence of a physical addiction, because most addictions are psychological and emotional. They create the urge to commit compulsive behaviors, which are usually in reaction to stress or anxiety. Obsessive behavior or obsessive mentality is the compulsive preoccupation with an idea or an unwanted feeling or emotion, often accompanied by symptoms of anxiety. Now, you might not think the thing that you're thinking of, say if you're a heterosexual young adult and you're thinking of the Kardashian sisters, you might not think of that as an unwanted idea. But then look at all the stress and anxiety that causes you when you realize you don't have the Kardashian sisters to play with. That can create a lot of anxiety. That can create a lot of stress, because you're never going to, in all likelihood, be with the Kardashian sisters. Not all at once, anyway. A compulsion is the uncontrollable impulse to perform an act, often repeatedly. It's an unconscious mechanism to avoid the unacceptable idea that my desires will not be met. Whoa. Fear, sex, politics, religion, workaholism. These are all concepts that we have devised in the West to give us the illusion that we're doing something about what it is that's bothering us. And this is just more obsessive compulsive behavior. Emotional and behavioral addictions, as I've said, are the most common forms of addiction. They're mental states in which the mind and body adapt to the presence of the infinite number of stimuli that we're exposed to on a day-to-day level. And the stimuli, because we're overwhelmed by them, are not delivering the same results that they used to. We get tolerant to them. We get tolerant to violence on television, violence in the movies, even violence in our streets. When I was young, there was a time when the murder of any human being, was going to be front page news. Today it's very commonplace, and life has become extraordinarily cheap. So we've become very tolerant to the idea of violence. We have righteous violence in our country, along with righteous anger and righteous chlamydia. I love that word chlamydia. It just sounds so venereal, doesn't it? The phenomena of overreaction by the brain to stimuli or to cues is associated with emotional and mental states. A person watching a TV show might feel an unpleasant mental sensation because he saw a cue, and that cue associated with an idea. And that idea, that sense of loss, creates sadness. And isn't it nice that we finally got to attachment, which happens to be this topic of the talk. Now, literally, attachment is an extra part or an extension that can be attached to something or someone to perform a particular function. A popular definition of attachment is an exaggerated sense of not wanting to be separated from that someone or something because that has literally become a part of us. We attach to our job title, we attach to our pet names, we attach to our organizations, we attach to what we think should be right and just, and we become averse to anything that opposes that view, which in and of itself is another attachment. That's why the Buddha did not talk a whole lot about aversion, because if you had attachment, you probably were attached to an aversion as well. If you like blue and you're attached to the color blue, that means you are averse to all other colors. If you feel that your bedroom needs to be in the color blue, in that particular shade of blue, then you have an aversion to any other color except that one being in your bedroom. It's really that simple. But it can become exaggerated to the point that we don't want to be separated from that blue color. Ever. Just as we have an exaggerated sense we don't want to be separated from someone or something. Think of puppy love. In puppy love, the couple never want to be alone, so they are chasing each other throughout life and making each other generally contemptible pests to one another. I've seen that in relationships a lot. Helicopter parents suffer from this exaggerated sense of not wanting to be separated from their children. And we don't treat those kinds of addictions because we feel they're endearing, they're important, they are nonsense, because they're totally interfering with the child's life. Attachment is the opposite of aversion, and because we label our attachments as being pleasant, our attachments are relatively subjective and based upon limited information. All we know is that looking at, well, when I was a kid, looking at that fold-out in Playboy, all I knew is that that was pleasant. The view was pleasant, the sensation was pleasant, and I was in love with the girl in the fold-out picture. But on the other hand, what did I know about this girl? And I had never even heard of airbrushing when I was 12. Attachment includes an aspect of not only exaggeration, but projection, as does aversion. Whenever we're attached to someone or averse to someone, we're not seeing them anymore. We are projecting onto them our hopes, our desires, our joys, our fears, our sadnesses, and threats. The near enemy of attachment. Near enemy is a cool word. It means not to be confused with, but it looks like, but don't confuse it with. And in this case, that near enemy is real appreciation, love, and compassion. Attachment might look like real appreciation, love, and compassion, but it really has nothing in common with real appreciation, love, and compassion. The main qualities of attachment are exaggeration of positive qualities, negation of negative qualities, and that can only lead to disappointment. Whereas in aversion, the exaggeration is of negative qualities and the avoidance of the positive ones, and that can only lead to disappointment. When we talk about attachment, falling in love usually explains this category very, very well. So that brings us to the topic of love. Love in and of itself. So what is the definition of love? Poets and philosophers have been discussing that for centuries. Love is the unconditional wishing that others be happy. Pure and simple. If I say I love you, it's because I want you to be happy. And there are no conditions placed upon you what you do with your life if you are happy. Love does not need to be conflicted with conditional love, which is attachment, when we place conditions on our love. The opposite of love is wishing others to be unhappy, and we term this hatred. It's also the opposite of love appears as egotism, indifference to others, or not wishing others to be happy, or not caring if others are happy or not. And the main qualities of love are simply the unconditional, non-self-interested, but self-accepting feeling toward ourselves and others. Compassion, which is the near enemy of attachment, is defined as the unconditional desire that others be free from suffering. It should not be confused with feeling sorry for someone or pity. While these emotions seem admirable, they're not only a waste of time and energy, they do a very big disservice to the other person. The opposite of compassion is wishing others to suffer, and we call this one cruelty. And the main qualities of compassion are to be sorry with someone, Compassion comes from compassio, or compassion, with feeling. It's the general urge to help another. Now, renunciation and detachment help in all this because they're actually necessary elements to compassion and actual love. And they're very misunderstood in Buddhism. Renunciation or detachment, also called dispassion, is the wanting to be free from the problems of cyclical existence. Not problems in general, but the emotional and mental problems that we cause in cyclical existence. It's not wanting objects that cause more misery, like being greedy, like being lustful, like being addicted to music or to art or to stuff, having stuff. It's not the impetuous excitement that leads to the abandonment of all possessions, escaping to a hermitage in an effort to escape the present condition. Such people usually fail and give up in a week or two, feeling very disappointed because they did not find their quick fix, an easy answer. The near enemy of renunciation is apathy, extreme asceticism, or actually suicide. And the opposite of renunciation is attachment to worldly happiness, ultimately leading to stress and suffering. Whenever we find that we're attached to something of the world, we know suffering and emotional decline is going to follow. The main qualities of renunciation and detachment is the discovery of what ultimately leads to misery and avoiding that. And what we mean by dispassion is not making an unwarranted, exaggerated emotional investment into anything. Renunciation comes from within. It is an inner wisdom, an inner knowledge. It's not a physical action, wearing monk's robes and living in a monastery. That is egotism when we do that. The problem with attachment, and there is a problem, I mean, we've been talking about it, attachment has the appearance of being less destructive than anger and hatred when it's in fact a much bigger issue than anger and hatred. Because attachment leads to the uncontrolled process of mental rebirthing, where pain and misery cycle with happiness and immediate gratification. This roller coaster of emotionalism that we tend to go through. Attachment to sense pleasures, including the intellectual sense pleasure, and ultimately to conditioned existence itself. That's where we're going when that is the problem with attachment. It seems to be a product of evolution. We have evolved that way because we have caused ourselves to evolve that way. It's partially the inborn survival instinct, and that has been used as an excuse by millions of people, and it's the main misunderstanding that holds us prisoner in samsara, the great wandering from one mental state into another. Because the survival instinct doesn't cause us to hurt ourselves. Attachment does. Attachment has been referred to also as the monkey mind. How do you catch a monkey? There are definite steps to catching a monkey. You cut a small hole in a coconut, just large enough for the monkey to put his hand into. You affix the coconut to a tree with a rope. You fill the coconut with a bunch of sweet candy, and the more perfumey the better. The monkey smells the sweet candy, knows that candy is around because all mammals are addicted to sugar. He squeezes his little tiny paw into the coconut, he grabs the sweet, and as he's making the fist, he discovers the fist doesn't fit through the hole anymore, and he can't get his hand out of the coconut. Because if he lets go of the candy, he can get out. But letting go of the candy is the last thing that monkey wants, so he holds himself prisoner, waiting for anybody that needs a monkey to walk by and pick him up. So, think about this monkey. Think about your relationship to this monkey. And now wonder to yourself, what's my monkey trap? What am I unwilling to let go of? Desire and attachment and debt. The Buddha made some noise about this. He compared desires to being in debt. As it turns out, if you owe money to a bank for your home, you make monthly payments. You make enough monthly payments, you eventually own the house. With sensual desires, you can never pay off the debt because they arise and arise again and again, sort of like your, tax collector waiting for his back taxes. They never go away. They always come back again and again. And sensual lusts such as sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, and ideas keep arising, and to try to fulfill those desires is like carrying water to the sea. It's never ending and ultimately a completely useless task. The Buddha did say much about attachment in the Pali Canon and in the Mahayana Canon. He said at one point, I have killed all of you before. I was chopped up by all of you in previous lives. We have all killed each other as enemies, so why should we attach to each other? He didn't necessarily mean previous incarnations. He could have meant our previous lives here in this lifetime, like last Tuesday or last year, when we were mad at each other and we chopped each other up and we considered ourselves enemies. Why should we attach to one another now? We can be friends, but we don't need to attach. There is an inherent suffering in pleasure. And this is something, this inherent suffering that exists within seeking pleasure is almost invisible to us because we're so into having the pleasure at the moment. We're so very into seeking pleasure, so we never notice the suffering it causes. It's a sobering experience when we deeply reflect in meditation on what we normally describe as pleasure. The Buddha said that relative to the blissful experience of release from cyclic existence, everything within cyclic existence is suffering. Why is it suffering? Because it's conditional. It has to meet criteria. When our criteria changes, it no longer makes us happy. Please take a few moments to reflect the following thoughts while taking any pleasurable experience in mind. Just sit there and think about it, the most pleasant thing that you could imagine here at this moment. How far is this pleasure? Simply a means of escape or a temporary diversion from your daily problems? How much of your motivation to gain this pleasure was that sort of avoidance and escape? Would you still be enjoying it if you kept it up without interruption for a few days? This pleasurable experience, if you continued engaging it for 2 or 3 days, 5 days, a week, a month, a year, would you still find it enjoyable if you never stopped doing it? And how fulfilled did you feel by this experience after 5 minutes? When it was over, did you still find pleasure in it? How about 5 hours later? Or 5 days later? 5 months later? Did you even think about it 5 years later? And to achieve the same great feeling as the first time, did you need more of it the second time? Was it just as good the second time, or was it diminished? Did you have to enjoy it more intensely? These are some of the things we might want to think about when we reflect on whether we really, really enjoyed that so-called pleasurable experience. Something for us to consider. The words of the Buddha again. Because after all, we are Buddhists, we might as well talk about the Buddha. The Buddha says many things about attachment in books like the Dhammapada. This is from, I believe, the Majjhima Nikayas, and it says, let me tell you about the middle path. Dressing in rough and dirty garments, letting your hair grow matted, abstaining from eating any meat or fish does not cleanse one who is deluded. Mortifying the flesh through excessive hardship does not lead to triumph over the senses. All self-inflicted suffering is useless as long as the feeling of self is dominant. You should lose your involvement with yourself and then eat and drink naturally according to the needs of your body. Attachment to your appetites, whether you deprive or indulge them, can lead to slavery, but satisfying the needs of daily life is not wrong. Indeed, to keep a body in good health is a duty, for otherwise the mind will not stay strong and clear. And that brings us to the opposite of what he was talking about, or what he had actually started talking about. Ordinary love is absolutely conditional. When we say we're falling in love, we're really becoming attached to someone. And this attachment, this love, conditional love, brings waves of emotion, usually creating an invisible dependency, a bondage, a slavery between you and this other person. It's called a codependency. The bonds seem unpleasant, even if the person is incredibly pleasant. Based upon selfishness, we become attracted to others because of arbitrary and irrelevant opinions as to what is beautiful, what is status, what is income, what is the importance of money, what is the importance of their zip code. And these things become obstacles for living happily with a person because we're constantly looking for something to fill the criteria that we have for our conditional love, someone to meet the conditions. The exaggeration and projections that we make onto the other person are the main reasons that ordinary love must lead to disappointment. It cannot be otherwise. Think about your high school romances. How many of those were completely satisfying? Being in love is very exciting emotionally, but is it happiness? It's often mixed with a fair amount of suffering. Attachments gives us the feeling of how can this relationship fulfill my needs? Real love would ask, what can I do for the other? Attachment based upon selfishness says, if you're good to me, I will be good to you. If you do what I want you to do, then I will love you. Altruistic love is based on equanimity. One realizes that all others are like me and want to be happy. It is the wishing others to be happy just because they exist. Just because they are people, they deserve to be happy. Just because they are cats, they deserve to be happy. Just because they are alive, even though they got 8 legs, spiders deserve to be happy. Everybody deserves to be happy. Wish politicians believed that way. But attachment leads to possessiveness. My husband, my wife, my friend, my family, my religion, my school, my belief, my truth, my country, my president, your president. See, the things that we don't like, we blame on others. Unless you believe in slavery, people cannot be owned. And even if you do believe in slavery, people cannot be owned. It's again the law. Possessiveness leads to fear of losing. The more jealous, the more possessive you are, the more jealous you become, the more you're afraid that your partner is messing around. Then we start faking our emotions out of this fear. We can become overprotective and helicopter-like. Craving and jealousy also arises. We feel that we can't live without her or him, or my car, my cat, my chocolate, my pizzas, my job, my jewelry, my music, my town, my country, my president, right or wrong. It is the perfection we think we see in the loved one. And we have to ask ourselves, is it really there? Or do we simply close our eyes to the negative qualities they possess? And is the perfection we're looking for even possible? So, here we summarize. Our projections, selfish expectations, and exaggerations are foundations of attachment and lead to inevitable disappointment. We want to get love rather than give love. We seek understanding rather than trying to understand. We want to be understood, but we really don't give a damn whether we understand the other person or not, because we probably feel we already do. We want self-confidence, praises, and cheers, but we really don't want to have to respect the other, because that would be terribly inconvenient if we respected everybody else. We seek praise and encouragement. We're not really good at giving praise and encouragement. We don't like criticism, but, it's okay to criticize others. We want to be heard, but we avoid listening. This kind of attachment, these mental addictions, attachments on steroids, when we study them closely, we see that the disease model of attachment and addiction is probably not terribly valid. This is the conclusion of many contemporary neuroscientists. Although the psychiatric establishment and the rehab industry in the West would have you believe that addiction, in all of its forms, is a brain disease. It's based on evidence that the brain changes with the use of a drug. The brain is going to change anyway. Whenever you do a repeated action, thanks to neuroplasticity, your brain is going to physically alter. Like cab drivers in London are known to have a part of their brain grow out of proportion to the rest of the brain so they can locate addresses and drive up these weird streets that they have in London. You ever been to London? It's a nightmare to drive through, much less walk through. Cognitive neuroscientists are starting to make convincing arguments that addiction, in any of its forms, whether chemical or emotional, are not diseases. The disease model has actually become an obstacle to healing. Addiction seems to be the unintended consequence of the brain doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. And again, let me quote the Buddha. Everyone wants to be happy. Everyone seeks to avoid pain. And we happen to live in a world that's not cooperating, and so the brain's looking for as many pleasurable things as possible. The brain is designed to restructure itself with normal learning and development, not restructure itself because we've added chemicals to it. This process is accelerated when highly attractive rewards are repeatedly pursued, like enlightenment would be an attractive reward for many, or sexual gratification an attractive reward for others. The treatment of addiction, when it's based on the disease model, often fails because it does not take into account the aspect of attachment. But treatment can be retooled to achieve lasting recovery given the brain's plasticity. This makes meditation and good basic dharma more important in our world today than ever. The methods that work against attachment are also effective against addiction. Mental transformation via meditation and reflection can be curative. It's not an instant solution, but then again, there are no quick fixes to anything. There's only instant gratification, which allows us to avoid what it is that we're feeling. Addiction is usually the result of an underlying problem or frustration. Addictions and depression go hand in hand. And there's usually a lot of mental or spiritual healing that is needed in attachment addictive cycles. And it often belies an underlying frustration or problem that we're trying to avoid. And meditation will help us unwrap that knot because it works on a very deep level. Well, about 100 years before Jung was writing about depth psychology, meditation was called the depth psychology. I'm sure he was aware of that. It's gradually transformative. It allows us to gain some control over our attachments, and it's usually needed in serious cases. So, Buddhism developed its own 12-step program. It developed it about 2,500 years ago, long before AA even thought about existing. Starts out with the truth of suffering. Step 2, the truth of the origination of suffering. Step 3, the truth of the ending of suffering. Step 4, the truth of the path. Leads us to step 5, right view. Step 6, right thought. Step 7, right speech. Step 8, right action. Step 9, right livelihood or lifestyle. Step 10, right effort, followed by right mindfulness, and capping it off with right concentration. And there are antidotes to attachment addiction cycles. These antidotes begin with first observing yourself. What's going on with you? What is happening in your mind? What is your body responding to in your mind? When you have a thought arising, does it appear somewhere in your stomach? Do you feel tightness in your temples, for instance, or in your stomach when you have certain thoughts and have the urge to commit certain behaviors? Then you can use your inner wisdom, because you already know the solutions. You're just avoiding those too. You reflect on the unsatisfactory nature of existence in and of itself. Nothing gives you lasting satisfaction as long as you're placing criteria and conditions upon it, that it has to be this way or the other way. Reflect on impermanence. Everything is changing, constantly changing. We're walking on quicksand. There is no solid ground. You can see this for yourself. Sit in a room and watch a point on the wall and notice how it changes, how you are changing, what your relationship to that point on the wall is. and how it too changes. We reflect on the problems of attachment. Is attachment necessary? Is it basic? Does it lead to happiness, or does it lead to just more frustration? Then we reflect on our bodily attraction to other bodily attractors. Am I really in love with this person, or am I just infatuated with the light they're reflecting my way? We look at the results of attachment. We can reflect on death. Our life is very, very short on the cosmic scale. Just a mere tick, the perpetual talk. When we die, what kind of life do we want to have lived? And we reflect on emptiness. By the way, points 2, 0.7, 0.9. Excuse me, wrong numbers. When we reflect on the unsatisfactory nature of existence, on impermanence, on emptiness, we're talking about the basic structure and characteristics of the universe. And I am Sensei Mui. I am saying thank you very much for listening. If you liked the video, even though it was a little long, hit the like button. If you didn't like the video, do what you want. Thank you, and bye-bye. Namo Amidala Buddha, y'all.